working on the F100s today. So we bought a all-in, alternator-only serpentine kit from CVF. We're gonna get it installed on the big block here. So now when we start it up, we can actually get that battery charging. So if you didn't see our last video, put the link up here. It was our first driving the truck. Now really it was just driving it on and off the trailer to get it over to our new garage here. But now that we know it runs, it actually drives, stops, turns, we're gonna put our pedal to the metal here and get everything going so we can make this into a daily driver. So again, this is CVF's alternator only serpentine kit. So it comes with our alternator pulley, our water pump pulley, crank pulley, new alternator, and a few little odds and ends to mount it up there. So I'm not gonna need a power steering pump pulley because I have an electric power steering pump, not worried about AC. So this is gonna be a nice, clean, and simple installation. I already did some of the work pulling off some of the old pulleys just to make it a little bit quicker here. We should be able to get this done in a couple hours. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Shouldn't film this because there's really nothing too exciting here, but we got the shroud that came with the Champion radiator, two 12-inch spall fans I just mounted on there. So now we're gonna get this mounted on the radiator, get the radiator in the car, and we can figure out hose lengths, start wiring everything up, the alternator, the radiator fans, and the electric power steering pump. All right, so the camera died on me yesterday, and rather than stopping and waiting for my phone to charge, I just kept moving forward. So you can see here, we got the rubber is actually being used. This rubber hose is being used to insulate between the shroud and the radiator, just to make sure we don't get any rubbing that rubs through the radiator itself. Now you'll notice here, we are very, very uncomfortably close to that crank pulley. What I've done is I've actually 3D printed some spacers so I can push the radiator more towards the grill, away from the crank pulley, and hopefully we'll get at least like a 1/4 inch of clearance between those. It's a little hard to see. We do technically have clearance, but it's about as minimal as it could be, maybe a piece of paper. So I'm gonna try to pull the radiator forward. I really wanna use the shroud. If it ends up being too much of a problem, I can always take the shroud out and immediately I'll get back like a 1/2 inch. I don't wanna jump right to that immediately because I think the shroud is gonna help a lot with cooling. So I'm first gonna try to get the radiator out of the way while using the shroud. If the shroud ends up being a problem, I'm just gonna pull it out and mount the radiator, the fans are right to the radiator. You can see we're moving right along here. We got throttle installed. I don't think I showed that to the group. This is just a hard throttle linkage. I trimmed to fit, added in my little spring here. So we have throttle now. We have the radiator installed. We have our alternator. Really the last few things I'll need to do, obviously, is all of the plumbing, all of the wiring, but we need to get the electric power steering pump installed. Once the electric power steering pump is installed, that's really all of our mechanical installation, and then everything from there is just plumbing and wiring. So things are moving along very, very quick. I'm super excited. Hopefully we'll be driving this fall, maybe get some pictures out with the dogs and the wife. All right, so this is where we're at. We see the serpentine belt, everything is installed. Now I got the spacers in here, much more room between the crank pulley and the fans. So if you look really closely down here, you can see there's little 3/4 inch plastic spacers I 3D printed, and that's what's keeping our really our radiator in the exact right position. It's actually nice and tight here. You can see it's actually very close. I could probably add in some foam in some different places to seal things off, but I think this is going to work out just fine. Now, I don't know if there was body damage in the past or something, but it was just a little narrow for my radiator. This will also be a difference between the aftermarket and whatever they measured. But all I had to do here is just cut a little slot. You can see if you look very closely. Just cut a little slot so that I could fit the radiator down that little channel. I had to do that on both sides here. So if you're like me and it's a little tight, just cutting that little slot and kind of working it in was enough to get everything to fit and line up. So pretty much everything has now been installed mechanically except for our power steering pump. This is the one I've kind of been avoiding because it's a little awkward. It wasn't meant to be in this engine bay, obviously. It is a Ford part, which is nice, and I'm gonna try to mount it somewhere around this front frame rail. That means I'll be able to do a straight shot to the steering rack right behind it, and also make it pretty easy to do some of my wiring. So that's my goal, is to try to place it on one of the frame rails, maybe this side or the passenger side. I was thinking the driver's side to kind of balance out where the battery is, try to do a little bit of weight balancing. But the passenger side might be easier from the perspective of wires, because basically it's a straight shot from the battery to my what will be my resettable fuse. And then right from there, we can also run the wires for things like the, for the fans and for the power steering pump itself. So that's where we're at now. I think I'm gonna start either measuring for the radiator hoses or start looking at how I'm gonna actually get that power steering pump mounted. So one other thing I'm working on while I procrastinate putting in that power steering pump mount and kind of building that up is a little gauge cluster here. So I'm gonna be able to see my oil pressure, water temperature, and my volts. Just a nice simple one off of Amazon. I'll put the link in the description. So I have the mounting plate mounted up there. And I've already started running the water temperature sensor. So I've kind of run it through a pre-existing hole. I'm gonna line that with some rubber. You can see I just gotta get mounted up in the front here. So I'm gonna add water and oil pressure, well, water temperature, oil pressure, and again, voltage. So I'm just getting those done basically to avoid building up this mount here, which I do have to do soon, but there's all these little pieces of the puzzle I can kind of work on in the meantime. All right, it's a little hard to see here, but we got the mechanical oil pressure gauge line installed. And then after watching some Vice Grip Garage and some other shows this weekend, I see how bad these plastic lines can be. So I already went and got a copper line kit, and I'm gonna switch this out with the copper equivalent. So gonna get that done, and then pretty much all the gauges will be dealt with, except for my volt meter, which should be pretty easy to wire up once we get into our wiring. All right, so we got these T-bolt clamps for the coolant system. I just prefer these. I think these are a little bit better, a little bit more robust. We'll get those on. I got these just flexible hoses off Amazon. I can put the links in the description. It's, I think, about a 14 and a 16-inch hose, respectively. So that's pretty much tying up the cooling system. I am waiting for a thermoelectric switch so I can actually trigger the fans. But otherwise, that's pretty much the whole cooling system. We have the coolant temperature gauge sensor here. We have the oil pressure one in the back. I added that copper line kit. So everything's in place so that I can actually get the power steering pump fit. So now that I know all the plumbing that has to be where it is, I can actually fit up where I think I'm gonna put the power steering pump right around here. I saw, like I said, Craig 909 do that. And I have a thick plate, so I think I'm gonna try the same idea. So I'll get these on first. All right, so we're finally getting into the power steering pump. Pretty much all I've done to this point is just trace out where I want it on my flat sheet. And then I'm gonna use my biggest hole saw I have to take away the most material possible. And then I'll start figuring out where I'm gonna drill for my holes for both the pump to mount to the plate and then the plate to mount to my frame, I think is what I've decided. All right, stop filming for a while because it can get a little boring, a little repetitive. But what we see here is with my thick steel plate, I mounted my original power steering pump bracket. I'm gonna still take out a little material on either side for clearance for the radiator, what ends up being the oil filter. And then I just need to clearance a little bit more for the pump itself. And then I'll add 2 holes so that this can mount to the frame inside the truck here. So I didn't film all of it because, again, it can get a little boring, a little tedious, just cutting holes, drilling, but it's getting very close. And I'll definitely see once this is mounted up in the truck how it looks. All right, so here's the rough idea. So this is actually fixed in here. Again, I'm gonna figure out how that plate mounts to the frame. Just clearance a little bit. I gotta clean that up, but this is really just to start test fitting it. So now I'll basically clamp it to the frame and start marking up how I can trim it down. And at least 2 bolts, maybe 3, depending on how big they are, I'll use to mount, and just a couple through holes in the frame, and just have, I might do like a little welded plate with nuts on it just to make it easier to capture those if they're gonna be in the frame, rather than having to do like screw tubes and everything, or little tubes to reinforce. I might just have it on one part of the frame and then just use a little backing plate with nuts on it. It'll make sense. I'll show it once I have that done. All right, so after a ton more cutting and grinding, this is the final plate, more or less. I still have room for, well, really plenty of room for 2 bolts. I can also reinforce if I feel like this is gonna bend at all. So now from here, again, I just need to fit it up on the frame and see exactly how it gets in there. So I'm gonna probably move over to a tripod so I can show this, how I can mount that on here. And then we just gonna mark up a couple holes, and this is pretty close to actually being done. All right, so what we have here, the main mount for the pump, that electric power steering pump. And what I just made is this little, basically a backing plate that I'm gonna put in the frame. I'm gonna weld a nut on one side of it so I can come from the top of the plate, be basically like this, the nut on the back side. So I can come from the top for this one, and then that common bolt that I'm using from the original mount, I'll have a second just through hole here that'll come up from the bottom of the frame. That one will be a little bit trickier, but I already have a welded nut on the little frame I have, so I'm just gonna use what I have. Even as I say that, I'm still debating, maybe I will just take that nut off, but we'll start with this one and we'll see how that works, and then I'll decide. The through hole isn't really that bad because I can get from the bottom of the frame, but top down also would be, for obvious reasons, a little bit easier. So I'm gonna think about that one. Yeah, I am gonna do that. Just talking through it, thinking of it. I'm just gonna cut this nut off of the original frame, and I'll make a second weld nut on the inside there, so I don't have to come from the top from the bottom for either one. That's much easier. So I'll just have this have 2 weld nuts that line up with these 2 holes, basically through the frame, bolt down, grab it, cool. So that's all we have for this one here, and we are closer than ever to getting this truck into daily driver activity. So we got the radiator with the fans installed, we have the serpentine belt kit from CVF along with the 1-wire alternator. I now have the gauges with our oil pressure as well as our water temperature. What else do we have here? I got a wire in the voltmeter. We have our electric power steering pump mounted. So really all we have left is some wiring and some plumbing. So that's what we're gonna cover in the next video, wiring up these electric fans that were not originally there, wiring up this electric power steering pump that was not originally there, as well as any other wiring we need to complete to get this into daily driver activity. So as always, thank you for joining. Subscribe if you like, hit the like button if you like, share with your friends, and hope to see you again soon.